This story is sure to provoke a skeptical smile from many, as it involves the bankruptcy of a financial company, millions of dollars in fraud, fake identities of one of Interpol's most wanted criminals, and yes, murder. On July 28, 1996, the fishing vessel Malcarry set out to sea from the port of Brixham in Devon on the southwest coast of the United Kingdom, with 2 fishermen on board. The first catch was disappointing, so they decided to sail another 6 miles to a spot where fishing boats rarely appear. An hour later, they began hauling in their catch, but along with the fish, they made another unpleasant discovery: a human body. The discovery of the body marked the beginning of an extraordinary investigation involving international inquiries, the involvement of Interpol, and a series of false identities assumed by the same individual. But at first, the Devon and Cornwall police believed they were dealing with a tragic, yet still accidental death. Given the high volume of boats passing through the channel, the police assumed that the man might have fallen from one of them, though there had been no reports of missing persons at the time. Surprisingly, the body was in remarkably good condition despite being in salt water. The man was dressed in a long-sleeved shirt, trousers, and brown shoes, with no identification documents on him. However, he was wearing a Rolex watch that displayed the time and date, July 22nd. The pockets of his trousers were turned inside out, as if someone had rummaged through them before the police. The examination of the body revealed several injuries, including a wound on the head. However, this didn't immediately raise suspicions, as the man had been brought to the surface during trawling, and the injuries could have been caused by the trawling equipment. The only distinctive feature on the man's body was a tattoo on the back of his right hand, which at first appeared to the police as a cluster of stars. However, the best clue to the man's identity came from his wristwatch. Detectives consulted with representatives from Rolex in London, who informed them that if the watch had ever been sent in for regular servicing, it might be possible to trace its origin. Rolex watches need regular checks by an authorized distributor or service center to maintain their accuracy and waterproof qualities. It was discovered that the watch had indeed been sent for servicing at a jewelry store in Yorkshire at the request of a man named Ronald Joseph Platt. Finally, the detectives were able to identify the man. They found his last known address. Ronald Platt had been living in a rented house in Chelmsford, Essex. When the local police contacted the landlord, he provided them with the phone number of the person Ronald Platt had listed as a personal reference when he moved in, a man named David Davis. Detective Sergeant Peter Redman of Essex Police recalls, "I called Mr. Davis, introduced myself, but refused to tell him the reason for my call because I didn't want to say that his friend might no longer be alive. But eventually, he forced me to admit it, and I had to tell him." It's hard to judge someone's reaction over the phone, but he didn't seem particularly shocked. He didn't start asking a lot of questions, as people usually do. David Davis agreed to meet with the police to answer their questions about Ronald. In reality, the police had few questions. They were confident that Ronald Platt had fallen overboard and drowned. It was an unfortunate accident. Only a few final formalities remained before the case could be closed. During the meeting, David Davis made a good impression on the detective. He seemed like a very pleasant person. The man explained that the tattoo on his friend's hand was actually a maple leaf, not a constellation. He promised to find a photo of Ron to show to the detectives, and he did. The case would have been closed at that point, but Detective Constable Ian Clenahan needed to speak with Mr. Davis again. However, Davis wasn't answering phone calls, so Clenahan asked a colleague in Essex to visit Mr. Davis's address and ask him to get in touch. Detective Sergeant Redman went to the given address. I had never been to that street before. The area looked quite rural, with only a few houses on the street. None of the houses had nameplates, so I went to the nearest house and knocked on the door. An elderly couple answered. I said I was looking for a particular address. They explained that I was mistaken and needed the house next door. Just to be sure, I asked if David Davis lived there, and they said, no, Mr. Platt does. The description of the man they knew as Ronald Platt matched exactly with the man known to the police as David Davis. We were talking about the same person. Detective Sergeant Redman reported his findings to the Devon police. Suddenly, it became clear that David Davis was far more significant to the investigation than initially thought, and it became obvious that he knew more than he had told the authorities. Redmond admits that he often wondered what would have happened if he had knocked on the other house and reached the correct address. He would have spoken to Mr. David Davis, who he expected to find there, and that would have been the end of the story. Instead, Redmond went back to talk to the neighbors about Davis and his family. Frank and Audrey told Redmond about their neighbor. Some time ago, he had arrived with a wife much younger than him and two small children, a baby and a child around 3 years old. The neighbors said that the family quickly integrated into the local community. They also mentioned that the man had a connection to Devon because he had a boat there, which he regularly took out to sea. The mention of the boat piqued the police's interest, but without knowing the boat's name or description, they didn't know how to find it. Investigators then decided to re-interview all witnesses in the hope of uncovering something they might have missed earlier. They started with the fisherman who had found Ronald. The fisherman reported that, along with Ronald Platt, the trawl had also brought up an anchor. The police took the anchor, though at that time they had no idea that it would soon become a key piece of evidence in the case. Meanwhile, the investigators were trying to learn more about David Davis's friendship with Ron Platt. Ronald's brother mentioned that Ron had been in a long-term relationship with a woman named Elaine Boys, who lived in Harrogate, North Yorkshire. The police spoke with Elaine and began to learn more about Ronald and the life he had led. Ronald and Elaine had lived together for 10 years until 1993. He was a very quiet, calm, pleasant, and caring person. Elaine said that Ronald's most prized possession was his watch. He was generally obsessed with electronics and precision engineering. He wore the watch constantly and never took it off. She also explained their connection to David Davis. Elaine had met him 5 years earlier in Harrogate when he visited an auction house dealing in art, where she worked as an administrator. It was a very quiet day with no phone calls, and the man spent about an hour and a half inside, talking with Elaine first about the auction, paintings, and antiques. Gradually, the conversation shifted to what the man did for a living. He mentioned that he was moving to Yorkshire and was looking for a place to live near Harrogate in the Dales. Then, incredibly, at the end of the conversation, he offered Elaine a job. She thought it was amazing, but remembered that she wouldn't be able to work for him for long because she and her boyfriend, Ron Platt, were planning to move to Canada. Davis responded that it was fine. He promised to help the couple save money for their move to Canada because Elaine would earn more with him than at the auction house. Elaine introduced Davis to Ronald, and their friendship began from the first meeting. Soon after, David Davis offered them a share in his new company. The new company was called Cavendish Corporation, which sounded very solid and reliable. He made Ron and Elaine the nominal directors of the company. When asked why, he explained that he didn't want to be a director himself because of his wife, who was demanding alimony from him. Therefore, he didn't want his name to appear on any documents. Davis claimed that his wife was building a brilliant career as a doctor in New York and didn't need any money. However, she was greedy and was trying to take her ex-husband's money. That was his explanation, and Elaine and Ronald simply believed Davis. Elaine's job involved traveling around Europe and inspecting properties, but none of them were ever purchased. Instead, during her business trips, she made deposits for her boss into his foreign accounts. Looking back, she realizes that Davis had drawn her and Ronald into his little world, which was, in reality, just a facade. But at the time, the couple never doubted Davis for a moment because he made an excellent impression on everyone around him. At Christmas in 1992, Elaine and Ronald were invited to Davis's home where they met his daughter, Noel. Noel seemed to be in awe of her father. Davis did most of the talking that evening, while Noel, although not overly shy, was still quite reserved. Before saying anything, she always looked to her father for approval. Davis gave the couple a generous holiday gift. Enclosed in Elaine's Christmas gift was a card in which Davis promised to buy them 2 tickets to Canada if they agreed to leave by the end of February. February 1993. For Elaine, this was a shock, as they needed to settle all their affairs within just 2 months. How could they just up and move to Canada in such a short period? But Ronald was thrilled with the offer because it was his dream. The couple did ask David Davis why they needed to leave so soon. He explained that they had always wanted to live in Canada, that it was a great opportunity, and he essentially convinced the couple to move. Moreover, he had a ready-made idea of how they could remain directors of his company. Davis explained that they could make rubber facsimile stamps with their signatures so that while the couple was in Canada, He could use these stamps to sign documents and checks. He added that he had always been the one managing the affairs, so the couple didn't find his proposal strange or suspicious. Ronald and Elaine left for Canada in February 1993, but life in the new country didn't go well. The couple struggled financially. Elaine couldn't work there, and Ronald initially had trouble finding a job. On top of that, it was the middle of winter, so they had a very tough time. After 5 months, Elaine returned home to be the maid of honor at her sister's wedding. Davis was also invited, but when he found out that Elaine didn't want to return to Canada, he clearly didn't like it. He started talking about how much he loved Ron, how he didn't want the couple to break up, and that everyone deserves a second chance. In short, he did everything he could to convince the woman to go back, but she was determined not to return to Canada. Just a few days after the wedding, Davis packed his things and left town. Elaine felt like her friend had cut her out of his life. He just left, leaving her only his mobile phone number but no address. What the woman couldn't possibly know was that from that moment, her friend started calling himself Ronald Platt and would continue to do so for the next 3 years. Elaine barely communicated with him or her ex-boyfriend, the real Ronald Platt. During this time, she learned that Ronald had returned to the UK, but she, of course, had no idea about the fisherman's discovery in July 1996. And when she last spoke to Davis, 3 months after the police investigation began, he didn't even mention it. At the end of the phone conversation, the woman herself asked if he had heard anything about Ron, to which Davis replied that he hadn't spoken to him since June because Ron had gone to France. It was only after speaking with the police that Elaine realized Davis had lied to her. The detectives told the woman they had spoken to Davis, but he hadn't been able to help them. She asked when this conversation took place, and it turned out it was several weeks ago, which made Elaine suspicious. She immediately thought something was wrong. The Davis she had spoken to recently hadn't told her that Ronald was no longer alive. Elaine suspected that Davis might be involved in what happened to Ron, so when he called her next, she was scared. She didn't know what to say, whether to tell him that she knew about Ron, but she decided that honesty was the best policy and told him. At that moment, his voice suddenly changed. Instead of cheerfulness, there were new notes in it, and he said he would like to see Elaine at work. The woman was afraid to scare him off and didn't refuse. She agreed to meet him for coffee. During the meeting, Davis expressed how sorry he was about Ron, but the woman felt the insincerity in every word. She could see that it was just an act. And yet she played along with him. But when he left, she called the police. Investigators knew that he would take a train home, so they went to Chelmsford Station. When the suspect was brought to the police station, he was searched. The documents in one pocket identified him as David Davis. The documents in another pocket identified him as Ron Platt. Now the police had evidence that he had been using Ron's identity, but that was not enough to charge him with murder. Detective Sergeant Redmond from Essex Police went to Davis's home to arrest the woman believed to be his wife. She didn't seem particularly shocked. Instead, she was more concerned about the well-being of her children. While she was packing for her daughter, a female officer who was with her noticed that the bag seemed unusually heavy. She looked inside and found several gold bars and cash, just what every 3-year-old needs. And that was just the beginning. The police found $25,000 in cash, 8,000 Swiss francs, 17 gold bars, and paintings worth $6,000. At that point, the police had no idea what they were dealing with, so they confiscated documents, paintings, and valuables. During the house search, the police also found photographs of Davis's yacht, the Lady Jane, but they still didn't know where to find the yacht itself. However, by a stroke of luck, one of the officers working on the case happened to be a sailor. He mentioned that he had seen the Lady Jane in dry dock and explained where to find it. The yacht was brought in for forensic examination. On a pillow in the cabin, they found hair and blood, as well as an empty bag from a store called Sport Nautique. Fortunately for the police, Ron Platt's fingerprints were found on the bag, and they discovered a receipt from the store during the search of Davis's house. Investigators questioned the staff at Sport Nautique, who were able to recall that 2 men had visited the store that day and purchased various items, including an anchor. But the anchor they bought did not match the Lady Jane. Moreover, the yacht already had its own anchor. However, the one they bought was identical to the one the fisherman had pulled out of the water along with Ron. When the pathologist saw it, he realized its significance to the investigation. The shape of the anchor exactly matched the wounds on Ron. Interestingly, there was also a distinct bend in Ron's belt, likely from where the weapon had been attached. Upon examining it, the forensic experts found traces of zinc, consistent with the coating on the anchor. The evidence against Davis was mounting, but it still wasn't enough to bring the case to trial. Believing that the man was an American, they sent his fingerprints to Interpol. This turned out to be a breakthrough in the investigation. Within hours, the detectives learned that the man in custody was neither Ron Platt nor David Davis. His real name was Albert Johnson Walker. He was a fugitive from Canada, suspected of embezzling millions of dollars, and he was on Interpol's most wanted list. The police began unraveling the web of lies spun by Albert Walker. Albert Johnson Walker from Hamilton, Ontario, seemed to be living the perfect life. A married man and father of 4, he had started a small accounting firm that grew into a large financial company with 6 branches and 24 employees. However, it appears that this wasn't enough for Albert because it soon became evident that he had defrauded 30 clients out of $3.2 million. Most of his clients were farmers, and he invested their funds in a company they had no access to, located in the Cayman Islands. But his business began to crumble in the mid-1980s when he decided to invest his clients' money in real estate and stocks, losing funds in both. As Christmas 1990 approached, facing 18 counts of fraud, money laundering, and theft, he took $3.2 million, his 15-year-old daughter Sheena, and fled to London. The police knew he had gone to Britain, but after that, his trail went cold. This was because Walker had assumed a new identity, that of wealthy American businessman David Wallace Davis. He likely initially used the Davis name simply to escape Canada and settle in Britain. But when that identity had run its course, he needed something new. Walker didn't have the necessary documents to get a job, so he seized the opportunity to start a business with another Canadian he had recently met, a TV repairman named Ronald Platt. Ron often spoke to Walker about his beloved homeland, Canada, and expressed his desire to return there. Ronald missed Canada so much that he even got a tattoo of a maple leaf on his right hand. Seeing an opportunity, Walker offered to pay for one-way tickets so that Platt and his girlfriend Elaine could move to Canada on the condition that they leave behind their signature stamps, so Walker could continue running the business. As we know, Platt accepted this offer. As soon as Ron was in Canada, Walker, now Davis, used Platt's documents and signature to assume the identity of his departed friend, while his daughter suddenly became his wife, who soon gave birth to 2 girls, Emily and Lily. Neighbors said that when the truth came out, they couldn't believe it. Of course, they had noticed the age difference, but otherwise, the neighbors seemed like a perfectly ordinary married couple. Walker quietly moved into a house that Platt had rented but never lived in. So, when Walker showed up there under the name Platt with a wife, no one was surprised. However, the man everyone knew as Ron Platt soon began to lose control over his carefully guarded identity. In 1995, he received news from Canada. The real Ron Platt was returning to Britain, returning for good. Walker had probably thought that by sending his friend to Canada, he could continue using his identity for the rest of his life. But that was not the case. Now, 2 Ronald Platts with the same documents and birth date were living in close proximity. Clearly, this was a threat to Walker's freedom. The fugitive from Canada had something to hide, something to lose, and a motive to kill Ron. Walker invited Ron onto his yacht, perhaps to go fishing, though, of course, with much darker intentions. Walker took the life of a friend who had trusted him completely, throwing him into the water. In June 1998, Albert Walker stood trial for the murder of Ronald Platt. He was confident. No one had witnessed the crime. No one could say how, when, or where it had occurred. However, the Rolex watch, which initially helped identify Ron, now provided crucial clues for determining the time of the crime. Even after being submerged underwater for a week, Platt's watch still held some of its secrets. The watch was waterproof and self-winding, but underwater and without movement, it stopped after approximately 48 hours. Since the watch stopped on the 22nd, the police determined that it had entered the ocean around July 20th or 21st. The GPS tracker on the yacht provided the remaining evidence. When Walker was arrested, Sheena returned to Canada with the children. 2 years later, she came to the trial. She stated that she did not know Mr. Platt had been in Devon before the crime, meaning her father had hidden from her the fact that the family friend had returned to Britain. She revealed that during that time, she, the children, and Albert Walker were also living in a cottage in Devon, not Essex. On the 8th day of the trial, Walker himself took the stand. He appeared confident, relaxed, and charming with the judge. He admitted that Ron could have been murdered, but insisted that he wasn't the one who did it. Walker explained that Ron's hair and blood could have ended up on the yacht's pillow because Ron had hit his head, but he had nothing to do with what happened afterward. The man lied convincingly and, out of habit, expected the crime would go unpunished. But for the first time in his life, Albert Walker failed to convince his listeners. It took the jury 2 hours to find him guilty. Walker was sentenced to life imprisonment. In February 2005, the convict was returned to Canada, where he would spend the remainder of his years in prison. He never showed any remorse for what he had done to Ronald Platt. Albert Walker nearly got away with this crime. The chances of the body being pulled from the water within 7 days in an area where fishermen rarely appeared were incredibly slim. If it weren't for the Rolex watch with its unique serial number on Ronald Platt's wrist, if it weren't for the anchor that the fishermen found with the body, if it weren't for the fact that an officer knocked on the wrong door and discovered that Albert Walker had assumed someone else's identity, the police might have simply closed the case, declaring that they had found Mr. Platt, and that would have been the end of the story.